in a modern organization. And so I'm going to ask each of us to introduce ourselves. So Charlie, you want to introduce yourself first?
Hi, so I'm Charlie Morrison. I work in engineering in the Life Labs diagnostics company. I've been in IT for about 20 years, most of that in cybersecurity. I've had a number of roles, including operations and strategy, and my current one in engineering. And I manage a lot of different platforms from endpoint to network and to cloud, and obviously the Lookout platform here.
Great, thanks, Charlie. Hazen, you want to introduce yourself next?
Hi, afternoon, everyone. My name is Hazen Valliant-Saunders. I've been in information technology and cybersecurity for a little over 20 years. I'm currently working with Shared Services Canada as the senior security subject matter expert for the mobile device fleet and deployment with respect to the Government of Canada. I'm based out of the National Capital Region. And yeah, I've got a number of designations, a couple graduate degrees, and some other great things. So it's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, great to have you. And Marius, are you on now?
Hi, how are you? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, some challenges as usually when you need to stuff.
Yeah, I think you have an issue with your virtual background. I don't know if you can turn that off real quick.
I know, but it is what it is. So yeah, Marius Lungu. I work in cybersecurity for the past 23 years. Different areas all over the place. For the past 5 years, I'm the leader for endpoint security stack integration for RBC enterprise-wide globally.
Great, awesome, good to have you. And so with that, let's. I'm just going to kick things off by just sharing 2 quick slides that are just related to statistics. Just to kind of set the stage a little bit here around what's going on in the mobile threat ecosystem as a whole. And then we're going to jump right into the panel discussion. We will have time to take questions from the audience as well. So I'm just going to share 2 here. One is just to show device encounter rates across Android and iOS devices. This is based on Lookout proprietary data of the number of devices that we've seen that encountered 1 or more threats per quarter. And as you can see, the trend going from 2018 to the end of 2022 is increasing, and that trend continues to increase. I just don't have the updated data for the partial year of 2023 yet. But trend of the number of threats that devices are encountering is going up. And if you look at it by region, we see, that it's pretty much everywhere, and it's across, enterprise and personal devices. Obviously, like personal devices are encountering more threats than enterprise devices. That doesn't mean that they're encountering more severe threats. Enterprises tend to encounter the more severe threats. Personal users tend to encounter more of the classic, toll fraud, try to scam someone out of some money, kinds of threats. But a couple of things I want to call out here. People have a tendency to think it's an Android problem, but you can see from the statistics here that Android and iOS devices, they're all encountering threats, and also that MDM might be sufficient. But our data actually suggests that the MDM managed devices encounter more threats than non-managed devices. And when we dug in a little deeper on this, it looks like it's actually more that MDM managed devices tend to be used more. So there are devices where people are clicking on lots of links, downloading lots of apps, doing lots of activities on those devices, versus the devices that aren't MDM managed tend to have less activity. And so thus there's less threats occurring overall. So I just wanted to start with just sharing some stats, just hopefully that helps kind of level set that this is a real problem and it's a growing problem. And then, with that, I want to start with, all 3 of our panelists here today. Thank you all so much for coming. You're all, from regulated markets, whether it's financial, healthcare, government. So would love to hear a little bit about why mobile security is important to each of your organizations. And Marius, maybe I can start with you.
Sure, thank you. So working for a heavily regulated industry, one of the main key controls for all our endpoints. And when we call an endpoint, it could be a laptop, it could be a server, different operating system, Linux, and also mobile, we call an endpoint here. So the most important thing is, and not important, but actually is regulated, is to have a EDR, an endpoint detection and response solution. So implementing a mobile endpoint security solution that protects against malware, spyware, riskware, man in the middle, rogue Wi-Fi, jail, broken devices, Trojans, etc. So it's mandatory to have a tool, MDM, as you mentioned, and as we're going to touch probably later, is not sufficient to have a organization. You have to have also a solid mobile endpoint security solution. So that's what we are looking from key control perspective.
Yep, no, that's great. And Hazen or Charlie, anything you want to add to that?
Sure, Charlie.
I echo Marius's comments. Mobile is just another endpoint. It's another attack vector, right? So we needed to have protections on that, including all the other things there. So having this is great for us.
For us, the federal government, being the federal government in Canada, we're literally governed by legislation in the House. So there's the duty to do care for data on any endpoint. We don't care where the endpoint is. Even beyond that, for us, we need to also be able to demonstrate formal compliance with things like ITSG 33, NIST 853, Rev 4, CMVP, FIPS, NIAP, and the management for us. As Marius said earlier, EPP and EDR are key, and being able to have a unified vision of the fleet and being able to offer a unified response in real time are the key requirements for our fleet.
Yeah, no, totally makes sense. I think, you all hit on the point that that mobile is just another endpoint, that you shouldn't consider these things as different and that they don't need the same level of protection. They absolutely need the same level of protection. I actually think in some ways mobile is very unique as an endpoint because it's follows you 24/7. So it's always in your pocket. It can listen to every conversation you're having. It can see everything you see. And it's the primary consumption device that most of us use today, right? Like it's how you consume content. You're not necessarily making, editing policies or those kinds of things for your mobile device, but you're reading reports, you're reading emails, you're communicating. It's a primary mechanism there. And many of us are using it as our MFA tokens as well. So, if you think about this, if you could only hack one device that belonged to somebody and you wanted to totally compromise their identity, the best device to get would be their mobile device, because that's the device that they can do everything from. They can authenticate with every other, every other service that they get access to from there. So if you could only hack one device, that would, in my mind, that would be the one to hack. So let's move on to the next question here. So, companies are obviously overrun with a wide range of different solutions. There's tons of different security solutions out there that, every organization needs to be on top of these days. We've talked about EPP and EDR and MDM, and, there's dozens of other things. So, in order to be able to successfully deploy these kinds of things, you need to be able to deploy them both simply and manage them efficiently at scale and integrate them within your existing tools. So I'd love maybe Charlie, you can talk a little bit about how do you incorporate mobile threat defense solution into the rest of your security tool chain.
Yeah, so we do have an MDM solution. We automatically provision the apps and the policies for our mobile phones. The integration between Lookout and our solution is actually quite seamless. We've made the connection, we've done the authentication, set up the policies, and so a new user just takes their phone and they sign into it, and all the stuff gets pushed down, including Lookout. but as you said, all these different products, it does create this sprawl, and it creates a management problem, especially with overlapping functions and features. You'll find that one product is one thing, one product is another thing, one does a third thing, and there might be some things in the middle where Lookout, for me, it does all of it that I need for my mobile fleet. It makes my life a lot easier, where I can have the policies and the configurations set in the one place and all the detections and everything. And I have to worry less about it because the policies get updated by the Lookout team based on their threat analysis and their research. And so I have to worry less about updating these policies and that, and I just let it go. It's been one of my least hands-on products that I've used. So I've been pretty happy with it in that regard.
Great. I'm glad to hear that. And have you or has anyone here set up any kind of advanced policies that cascade out to the MDM, like based on threat detections or any of those kinds of things?
Yeah, sure. Oh, if I could add on Charlie. So yeah, you nailed it though. So not only that you have to have a good integration with the MDM, whatever you choose to have, but as we all know, having a mass will be good on detection and creating different policy for different category of risks assigned. But then the enforcer, at the end of the day, is the MDM. So it depends how you want to play it. Of course, for high risk, you have to decide what the enforcement would be from the MDM perspective. You might want, of course, the user will get a communication to try to get rid of the threat, an app or whatever it is. But at the end of the day, you want to enforce it. If it's a high, then you might want to disable the container for your getting access to company's data until that user will clean up the device. Or it depends on the threat. You have different actions that the MDM actually would be enforcing them down to the mobile. So yes, mass is the product, like Charlie said, that will dictate the risk based on the threat. But then the MDM, through the connector that you have and the policies on the back end on both, not only mass, but also on the MDM, you'll have different category of enforcement for the end user and the device at the end of the day.
So to your point, Marius, we actually have to have a graduated response in terms of having the mobile threat defense act as a compliance provision agent on the device, saying the device is or is not in compliance with the existing security policy and directives that we've pushed to it. And should it fall out of compliance, one of the problems we have is we've got a deployed fleet of about 190,000 devices, and they're deployed globally. We don't just operate in Canada, we have missions all around the planet. And as a result of that, we don't have the luxury of being able to have a handhold or high touch deployment. And we also don't have the luxury of allowing any sort of malware or any sort of detection to go unresponded to. And for us, it's basically being able to say, hey, you as a department or agency can say, this is what I want my response to look like, right? This is what, if the device falls out of compliance for more than 24 hours, it gets wiped, right? The data's gone, the keys are gone. If the device is stolen, on all these different use cases that basically allow us to use the mobile threat defense platform as an extension of the existing MDM security policy that allows us to increase the security posture on the endpoint.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And that's the precisely, we've built with those ideas in mind. I mean, that this mobile threat defense is something works side by side with an MDM. We make sure that we can escalate the policy detections, communicate them quickly to the MDM. You can create those cascading policies of, after 24 hours, take this action, after 1 hour, take this action. And, the whole goal here really to be able to automate most of your response, especially for the most common things like, you've got to keep OSs up to date and apps up to date and address vulnerabilities and those kinds of things on an ongoing basis. And those are things that people are going to run into on a daily basis, right? So you've got to make sure that you've got intelligent policies that make sense, that allow you to kind of cascade through
Only one more thing to add. I mean,
Sure.
overall, since we all agree that mobile is just another endpoint to protect the organization and the firm, if you could integrate with your SIEM all critical events and create playbooks and SIEM rules in order for your SAC analysts or whatever you have at the organization, it's also good because now you have events that are gathered from various different endpoints that particular user may own and log them into a corporate laptop or mobile, whatever is the case. So SIEM integration, as you get more mature, is it's good.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, you get to the point where, you know, we start to get to another 3-letter acronym here around XDR and this, or security orchestration and so on and so forth, where yes, ideally you have all of these things feeding data into a centralized place where you can act intelligently, query across policies and you know, automate your response posture.
Hazen is laughing, but I know
it's a good dream to have,
Yeah.
and everybody has it. And being able to coordinate. I mean, one of the big things right now, and I mean, obviously there was a whole bunch of, you know, being able to enforce the endpoint policy is one thing, right? Saying, hey, you need to keep your iOS up to date. And I'm sure everybody knows, as of last Monday, there was this huge release in response to 0 days. Yeah. That's a big one. But beyond that, you also have things like, once you have XDR in place, you can detect, you know, MFA, MITM attempts in real time. And that's a real problem right now because people, they're like, well, I've moved my organization and we use MFA everywhere, right? And it works. But then I have my user where it's like, well, the user gets phished, they click on an email, there's an MFA reverse proxy being hosted somewhere. And I can't see that from the SIEM or from the XDR perspective if I don't have the endpoint integration across those two horizons, right? And it's sort of like, unless I can coordinate and say, okay, well, you know, I see that the authentication attempt occurred from their laptop, but then I'm getting the secondary proxied attempt coming from, I don't know, Azerbaijan, Timbuktu, wherever it is. And I know that their mobile is next to their laptop on the same network, right? Just being able to do the cross origin on those two things. I mean, it's a lifesaver for us internally. That being said, it took about 8 years of engineering work to get the systems in place to actually do that.
Yeah, it's very, very difficult to get these things to communicate with one another, but it can be very powerful at the end of the day, assuming you can trust the data that you're getting enough to actually, you know, fully automate these kinds of responses. That, you know, we've touched on this a little bit, but maybe we can address it quickly here. You know, we've talked about kind of the difference between MDM and mobile threat defense. You know, I don't know, like Hazen, if you want to kind of chime in a little bit about how, you know, how you would compare or contrast those.
So the big difference between mobile device management and mobile threat defense is the migration of the enforcement of security policy from the actual device itself, right? Like most MDM platforms can do application installation, containerization of your applications on the endpoint, you know, but they're limited in that they may or may not have the facility to do outbound and inbound traffic inspection. They may or may not have the facility to do rogue AP and Wi-Fi detection. They may or may not be able to detect insecure connections to things like Bluetooth or NFC. And so really, the feature set on the endpoint sort of dictates what sort of risk you have, right? The more radios you put on a device, the more risk it's going to have. The more data interfaces you put on an endpoint, the more risk it inherently has. So when it comes to mobile threat defense, being able to take a granular security policy and push it to that edge, saying, yes, I want you to tell me the device has fallen out of compliance when it connects to that Starbucks Wi-Fi that's known to house fire sheep, or that hotel in Nevada that's known to be a malicious place. Those sorts of issues are things that we look at. When we look at MDM policy, we're basically just ensuring that, yes, the device itself is a known corporately purchased device, and it's been enrolled in a corporate enterprise program. And that's sort of where MDM starts. And then where it gets a little bit better is that it becomes the management agent across the fleet, right? So you've got the mobile device manager that acts as the security policy enforcement agent that receives your security policies and your directives for your platform to sort of determine what the posture is on the platform. But most MDM platforms fall short of those other areas where they can't, you know, it's very unlikely for a mobile device management platform to tell you that one of your users is connected to an insecurely configured Wi-Fi AP, or that there's been an attempt to breach that radio interface on that device, or they've downloaded the latest version of Flappy Birds, right? You know, your MDM will say, and again, it depends on your activation type as well. And I mean, we have both, like we have various different types of activations, but the corporately owned and personally enabled, where we say, hey, here's the work side of your device, and this is the, you know, your personal side, and these two sides should never talk to each other. Well, then the risk profile in that environment becomes that personal side, right? And, you know, modern APT groups, they operate as developers in both of those ecosystems, right? And modern threats will use those personal applications to breach the device. And so without being able to gauge between those two things, or without being able to detect and respond to those two things, that's where, you know, the increase in security posture comes from with respect to mobile threat defense versus just MDM by itself, right? With MDM by itself, I'm either saying, yes, the application store is open and you can download whatever you want on your personal side, and that's the risk posture, and we're just going to accept it. Or alternatively, if I deploy mobile threat defense to an endpoint, I can say there's the reasonable expectation that should something go wrong within the application ecosystem in those environments, that there will be a response that happens in near real time. And that's the big difference between those. For us, when we deploy systems, we look at the risk cases and we're like, yeah, there are instances where we can't trust the carrier. We can't trust the network. We literally can't trust anything the device connects to. And so we need to figure out a way to gauge and measure the security of those systems on that endpoint.
Yep, no, completely makes sense. You know, you touched on something else interesting. You started talking about, you know, you got corporate owned, personally enabled devices and things like that. You know, I kind of view this as a spectrum, right? You've got everything from like the fully managed, supervised, lockdown kiosk mode device that, you know, perhaps like it sits in a conference room and it controls the AV equipment or something like that. And then on the other extreme, you have the completely personal device, no management or anything. And you've got all these different grades in the middle, right? Like corporately owned, personally enabled, and work profile that's been inflated on a personal device, and different things like that. So I'm curious, and maybe I'll just open this up to everybody here. How do you think about the different ways that devices can be managed and how that affects their security profile and what you need to do to secure them versus what data you give access to on those devices, so on and so forth?
So I can start, but I know I don't know how much time we have. But I mean, don't forget about bring your own device. So you already mentioned different flavors. So you have to have a MDT for your BOID user that they want to get access to the bank resources, whatever it is, calendar, email. So I know that is going to be tough on enforcement. You're not going to wipe them, but you're going to probably want to block that BOID to access corporate data. But regardless, all your copy called BOID, they have to have a MDT, and BOID, they have to be enrolled on MDMs also. I heard that some organization, they just manage the application or the device, but we have to kind of, hey, you want BOID, we have to enroll it on the MDM. So
to your to Marius's point, you know, corporately owned, personally enabled, kiosk mode, BYOD, MTD is an enabler, right? And as an old security hat, we're enablers, right? We don't say yes or no, you can or can't do this. We just say, you know, here's the risk, right? You want to allow people to bring their own devices into your environment to grant them access to your data. Well, I have an MDM. I can enroll the device in the MDM, create a container on the device if it's one of these flagship models from Android or Apple. And then based on that, push an MTD to the device to sort of get a good gauge on the security posture. And then going back to that graduated security response, it's like, well, at the end of the day, we don't own the device, so we can't wipe it, but we can wipe the container. And we can have a high degree of assurance in terms of once those keys are out of the containers, right? Or assuming it's a Qualcomm device out of the trusted execution environment, or assuming it's an Apple device out of the secure enclave, the data is gone, right? So unless they were running some sort of advanced forensics that I don't know if they exist or not, there's really no way for that to sort of happen. But that being said, we have all of those use cases, right? We've got partners that say, hey, I want my organization of 60,000 people to BYOD. I don't want to have to pay for their phones, right? They can bring their own. And it's like, well, what does that look like? And then how do we comply with that request? Beyond that, we have kiosk mode devices, right? And our kiosk mode devices are just lockdown workspace only containerized devices where it's like, yeah, you get these 5 applications and that's it. You're not getting anything else. And no, you can't connect to Wi-Fi. You're only ever on the cell network, and you're only ever going to work on this cell network, right? And so because we have that spectrum, in cases where you need to offer that spectrum to your organizations or to your clients, MDM is a key requirement, but MTD facilitates the enablement of BYOD.
Yeah.
And just to add, and then I'll mute. So very good points, Hazen. What I'm seeing for heavily regulated organizations is actually to drop that down on bring your own devices. And actually they're moving from even from a copy to a cold, which is a lockdown. So OSFI regulation, many other regulations. So I know a few years ago, I don't remember 5 or 6, the trend was BYOD is going to conquer the world. Actually, yep. I'm seeing dropping down because of the regulation. And on the mobile side, you're going to get locked down. Still need not only the MDM, we still need the MDT, but that's the trend for heavily regulated environment.
To speak to the heavily regulated environments, like we have users that are working in law enforcement, right? They're regulated under justice, under the Department of Justice. We have other users that are regulated in healthcare. In terms of privacy, when you're dealing with BYOD, one of the more serious considerations that we had when we deployed our mobile fleet was, how do we do a corporately owned, personally enabled, and what do the privacy risks look like for the individual applications that user is using? Because here in Canada, we have the expectation of the protection of privacy via the Privacy Act. We also have the expectation of privacy with respect to our personal interactions on the internet. And as a corporate organization, when you're looking at that policing, that XDR, all those other things, in terms of security, the organization itself is granted, with respect to the federal government, they're granted the authority to allow security precedence over individual or personal privacy only in cases where the personal applications pose a risk to the actual enterprise or to the enterprise data. Now, that being said, in the United States, there's no such expectation, right? There's no Privacy Act per se. The other issues around policing or considering the posture of the privacy on the endpoint is, if you have a mobile threat defense client on your endpoint, you can say, yeah, we're going to enforce formal certification for your application. So if we see an application that's not using appropriate protective mechanisms with respect to encryption of communications to its own servers, then you can have that alerted to. So you can say, yeah, this new version of Bumble isn't using TLS correctly, or this new version of Instagram isn't configured correctly to actually encrypt data in transit. So when considering personal privacy in the BYOD environment, you can look at it that way. The other perspective is, you don't want people carrying 2 devices, right? And one of the big problems for us as an organization is shadow IT. We can't have people doing, right, official business on unofficial, unmanaged devices, right? And for us, that was the primary reason for just adopting MDM to begin with and adopting COPE to begin with, is to say the risk of shadow IT becomes so great that we have these people doing official business and we're working in this regulated market, but we're not in compliance with our regulations because of shadow IT within our workforce.
And to your point earlier, people want access. They want access everywhere, right? And they don't necessarily want a second phone or don't want a corporate phone, but if they want their email or their calendar, threat defense is an easy add-on to say down or push down to them and say, here's a protection. It's not going to look at your personal stuff. It's not going to look at your messages or emails. It's going to protect you against those threats and protect the corporate data should you have access to it. So it's an added benefit.
Yeah, and I can at least just speak on behalf of Lookout here. We have been extremely paranoid and thoughtful about the way we design privacy controls into our products. Because we built mobile threat defense, every device needs to be protected, whether it's the personal device or the lockdown kiosk device. So we've really tried to make sure that we are thoughtful about the way that we enable organizations to be able to say, hey, like I want to block malicious web traffic on this device, but because it's a personal device, I don't want to alert the administrator about the URL that was blocked, maybe just the category that it was a phishing site they clicked on or something like that, right? Where then on another device, a fully managed device, you might have a different expectation of policy. So we've tried to be very thoughtful about making sure that this is an appropriate solution that can be deployed everywhere, because we know MDM isn't, right? Like you don't want to just manage every device that's out there. That's it's overkill in a lot of scenarios for to go and try to like manage someone's personal device. The last thing I want to talk about here before we kind of go to any questions, perhaps from the audience here, and you can go and drop in questions at any point in time, is to just talk about some of these most recent threats that we have seen in the news. So we already kind of alluded earlier to BlastPass. So last week there was actually 2 different iOS 0-day vulnerabilities that had emergency patches, one on Monday and one on Friday. Busy week. iOS 17 also came out at the same time. So it's like all that happening all at once. A little bit dizzying. And then of course that neither of those were the big news stories either. The big news story was MGM and Caesars and what had happened with the ransomware attack against them that was performed by a scattered spider. Just want to kind of open it up here. Like, what are your thoughts on where does mobile threat defense help in these kinds of situations? Where does it not, where is it just one piece of a puzzle, and that, you need a broader strategy to address those kinds of threats? I don't know who might want to go first on that one, Hazen.
Sure. Yeah. So when you look at things like MGM Grand and Caesars, it's a great example because you've got you have a criminal group, and then that criminal group is basically saying, okay, I've got a foothold in this environment and I'm going to exploit that foothold any way I can, right? And I mean, ransomware, every time I read about ransomware, the fact that I've been in this industry for 20 years, I'm like, what do you mean you don't have good backups of everything in near real time? What's wrong with your CIO? And then I'm like, oh, you're in Vegas and you're a casino. You're lucky if the computer is actually working to begin with. That being said, good IT policy and, in terms of planning, right? We have, formal disaster response. We have formal incident response. We've got more frameworks than we can think of that you can throw at these things. And I mean, for us, the formal environment, when we look at these things, we know what the malware looks like, and we know it's going to change and it's going to evolve, right? We know that, people in malicious organizations have push button polymorphic viruses that they can basically purchase with Bitcoin. We know the traditional attack vectors, phishing, smishing, whaling, watering hole, man in the middle, man in the browser, right? MFA in the middle, just to name a few. And we know what those look like. And when we look at those scenarios with mobile endpoints, they're uniquely positioned in that we need to be able to take the security policy that we would use in those traditional environments like MGM, where we would have an edge device that inspects outbound connections and then alerts to that outbound connection saying, yeah, you've got this server that normally does transactions for this merchant connecting to that network over in Eastern Europe that shall remain nameless. And you get that alert. But on the mobile devices, when we're dealing with just MDM only, that visibility doesn't exist. So being able to push that security visibility to that endpoint, and then being able to say, okay, we can model these attacks on that endpoint. We can say, you know, are we going to comply with the OWASP top 10 for that endpoint, right? Are we going to be able to do MITRE, ATT, and CK threat modeling on it? Can we simulate via, you know, red and blue team events on that endpoint, you know, what Octopus and Scattered Spider would look like if they try to attack that endpoint? Can we see an attempt at exploiting the WebP library on that endpoint when it tries to reach back to a command and control? And for us, that's sort of what it boils down to, is that we need to have that detection and that response, and we need to be able to deal with those issues. In terms of the iOS release that just happened, the other thing is, you know, I don't know about everyone else on the call, but I typically have CIOs coming to me saying, hey, this release just happened last week. How many devices do we have that are affected? And what is our response going to look like? And for us, we can plan that response. We can say, hey, we've got a fleet of 65,000 iOS devices, and of those 65,000 iOS devices, 70% of them are affected by that vulnerability. And then we can create a compliance policy and move forward that way. We try not to focus so much on the individual releases because it is a really, really, really busy environment, and there are many, many releases that happen every year. And just having the facility in place to respond to them, to us, is the important part, right? And just being able to plan for them and being able to facilitate simulations and hackathons where we can say, yes, if this were to happen on this device in this environment, we would actually see it happen, or at least detect the outbound traffic.
So do you?
So Hazen, you kind of cover everything, but just a couple of highlights which are important, aligned to any framework, but we like the MITRE ATT&CK framework.
Of course.
Yeah, so that's just a highlight for the participants. And you mentioned a very good point on a previous question about zero trust.
0 days, yeah, 0 days and zero trust.
And zero trust for you, for when you think about your mobile fleet. Yep. And what you trust and what you don't trust. But at the end of the day, just to add, I mean, any actor will be looking, regardless, they try to tap into a laptop, desktop, server, or mobile. They're looking for pretty much the same type of elements, steal the credentials and the passwords, obtain companies' data logically, lateral movement, land and expand to get from the mobile to an organization network, and whatever they want, deliver malware, command and control. I mean, it's like we said from the beginning, don't treat mobile as, you know, mobile is just a phone. I mean, it's another entry point. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, if you look at the Mandiant report on Scattered Spider, you know, you'll see essentially there's a lot of dwelling there around how they moved laterally once they got inside of the organization. But actually, the foot in the door was all mobile. Yep. Voice phishing, SMS phishing, MFA interception, all of the, like through, you know, setting up a fake Okta page and different stuff like that. You know, that was all stuff that was occurring on somebody's mobile device. Then you got access to their account, you compromised you had total control of that account, you moved laterally, you stole data, you exfiltrated data, you did, you know, all sorts of interesting things there. But the entry point was really mobile.
So to your question, installing a malicious application, right? Yeah, like if I can get in, as an example, if I can hire an APT group and I get them to develop a malicious application, and then I manage to push that application to an endpoint that's a target. There are many ways to go about that, right? And what we've seen obviously is, yeah, you know, phishing is the preferred standard. I send you a link that I know you'll click on. But beyond that, there are other methods that we've seen where, you know, somebody operates a malicious LTE base station, right? And that's specific to mobile, and maybe to a certain degree laptops, but realistically, if I can, you know, basically become your network services provider, or if I have enough engineering resources, and I call it the spaghetti at the wall technique, right? If you've got an APT group and they want to get into your organization, they're going to try everything they can. They're literally going to throw every strand of spaghetti at the wall, and whichever one of those strands sticks, they then pull on that strand to gain their foothold, move laterally, right? Elevate their privileges, gain administrative rights, bypass MFA if they can, or create their own MFA tokens, as we've seen in the past, where, you know, you compromise the certificate, go from there and say, yeah, I'm now your local registration authority in your organization. Because I've compromised that position, I can then create certificates for my malicious actors. And then it goes back to the, well, do you have the XDR in place to determine whether or not they're authenticating from this geographic region or that one, right? And do you have those policies in place at your actual cloud services provider, right? And that's sort of where, you know, and it goes back to Bruce Schneier's adage: the enemy knows the system. They are well versed in it. They will simulate it, and they will find any way they can to get in. And subversion of those processes and procedures is usually the first.
Yeah, and you know, as an attacker, you only need to get right. You only need to be right once, right? Like you only need to. You can you know, you can pray and spray, and you only need to get one hit to do something meaningful. And as a defender, you need to, or as we are all defenders of the data at our organizations, regardless of whether we work in cybersecurity or not. You know, it's all of our responsibility. We all have to be right all of the time. In order to keep the attackers out, or, you know, as we increasingly have moved to a world where it's like, assume that the attacker is going to get in, and make sure that you can focus on limiting the damage, you know, when they do so. So another question came in around, there's been a lot of talk about blocking apps. I'm guessing, I'm thinking TikTok might be something that's on this person's mind. You know, where does MTD kind of play into this?
So for us, the mobile application reputation service is key, right? And we look at it and we say, is this a known good publisher, right? Is this a known bad publisher? And it's a boil the ocean scenario to try and police the application stores, right? That's the problem. You know, you've got a team, you've got an engineering team of 5 or 10 people, and then you have an app store that's got 165,000 applications in it. And then you have organizations that are operating as development firms where, you know, they release Flappy Bird's clone version A, right? And that gets registered as a known bad via whatever honeypots we're running. And then from there, you know, that same development firm goes out and renames it, right? And one of the problems we have with mobile device management is we can name that application, and every version of that application will get registered as malicious. But the moment that that name changes, it's a new application. So that's part of the problem. Where, you know, if you have a mobile threat defense system in place, the MTD will actually say, hey, Flappy Bird's version 2 is connecting to the same known bad location, or is behaving the same way as Flappy Bird's version 1, and here is your risk alert. And then based on that, going back to the graduated response, you can say, yeah, okay, we're going to lock the device, or we're going to wipe the device, or, you know, take action based on that. And that's sort of where we see it, and that's sort of how we implement our policies with respect to mobile threat defense and MDMs.
Okay. Makes sense.
For the artificial advancements, so there's a question.
Yeah. So so another member of the audience said they work in PKI. They're wondering about how they can use PKI equipped with AI advancements to leverage mobile security benefits like the wrist posture of the device, those kinds of things.
So I don't know how you'd bolt an artificially intelligent system to a PKI. I don't even know what that looks like. I spent a number of years deploying various PKI solutions for organizations like Entrust and Thales. But artificially intelligent systems are really good at finding things, right? Like classifiers are good at saying this is good or this is bad. Bayesian classifiers are something we use every day to look for malware. In terms of artificially intelligent systems and the advance of things like ChatGPT and large language models, if you're looking at ChatGPT-3, ChatGPT-4, there's actually an application that was published in Git not too long ago, and it's called Pentest GPT, and your red team can use Pentest GPT to sort of have ChatGPT go through the 55,000 different tools that are available to every pen tester and guide them through what a pen test would look like. But we're not seeing the use of artificially intelligent systems with respect to trying to attack PKI. Right? Like PKI is one of those things, when it's implemented well. You've got a mature security organization, you've got mature stances on how you enroll your keys, how you deploy your keys, and how you revoke your keys. And those are the three big ones, right? Me as an individual registration authority, if I'm enrolling you as an individual user in an organization, even if I'm doing it remotely, as we had to because COVID made sure everybody couldn't talk to anyone, I would be like, first of all, your name is first name dot last name. Your identification is, your passport or your driver's license or whatever. And then I would turn around and I would feed that information into a verification system that would have access to those databases, right? So depending on where you're doing this and what kind of regulated industry it is, generally it's a background check or something similar. And it says, yes, this person is John Smith, or John Wick, if you will. And depending on that, I would say, okay, I can cut this person's key, right? And once I cut that person's key, I would hand that person that key and I'd be like, here's your key. You signed your life away for acceptable use when we gave it to you. It's part of your contract. And if you ever abuse this, you're open to all sorts of legal and other liabilities. That being said, the key attacks in those scenarios are always subversion, right? If I can create a fake identity and then create a fake John Smith and then have John Smith pass that procedure, artificially intelligent systems are sort of getting there. Like we're seeing that with generative AI, and we're entering the uncanny valley where, I've got a system that can be like, hey, but we also have the same mechanisms to detect it, right? And so if I'm operating as an LRA and I've got access to the video feed, I can punch that video through an AI detection utility that will say, yep, this pixelation that's happening on the edge of that person's forehead was generated by, one of the generative AIs, right? Yeah. And then I'll be like, okay, this person's not real.
Yeah.
Right. And we've seen some cases like that happen in industry where people are using AI tools to try and enroll in those programs or apply for those positions. But generally, we haven't seen successful subversion.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the main thing we've been seeing, we've definitely seen malware written partially by artificial intelligence tools. We definitely observed those kinds of things happening. Creating compelling phishing emails, and phishing outreach, and those kinds of things. Like, yes, you can do that at scale. You can create campaigns that, maybe previously would be a slightly high skill job that's now a low skill job, to go and create a convincing email to just like the sales team might reach out to you to try to get you to respond, to create it's the same kind of thing, to create a convincing email to trick someone into doing something that they that they shouldn't do. And of course you've got like you referenced the ability to sort of like automate the various red team exercises.
Yep.
That's kind of metasploit on artificially intelligent metasploit at some level, right?
It's metasploit on
the script kiddie.
Yeah, it's metasploit on steroids. But the problem is, because of the tooling in the tool set, you still need a skilled red team engineer sitting there going, hey, yeah, okay, this is a good thing to do, because the expert systems are they're nascent, they're in their infancy right now, right? And my favorite example is the recent Chat GPT, I think it was 3.5 or 4 test, where it went out and task rabbited the captchas, right? And like Chat GPT said, well, you gave me $100 and said, go make money. And I get stuck behind this CAPTCHA and I can't solve it. So then I went to TaskRabbit and lied to a human to get the human to do the CAPTCHA for me, right? And yeah, that's like, oh, that's the end world. No, that's a specific scenario with a specific system. Are we seeing those systems being used for what we would traditionally do within red team, blue team, and purple team exercises? It's more like an aid, right? So if you've got a good team of individuals, they can act as an aid. But the systems themselves, that level of automation, we're not seeing it. We're not seeing it at the same scale. We would expect to see it at the scale of like distributed denial of service campaigns would be automated, right? And we know they're not, right? Because we have access to that information. When we see them, we're like, yeah, we know there's a targeted campaign against this bank or against this government agency or against this one, because we have that XDR, we have that visibility in place to see it happening.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder if maybe we touch briefly on like, post-quantum encryption or post-quantum computing or something like that. That might be what's gonna, what's going to crack all of these problems wide open. Now, of course, no one here on this call, like, it could be 50 years away. It could be,
20.
It could be 1 year away. It's hard to really know.
So there's a post-quantum cryptography symposium that happens every year, and I recommend it to all my friends who are interested in cryptography. So all my other math nerds. And the reason I say that is because AES is vulnerable to Shor's algorithm, right? And Shor's algorithm, when properly implemented on a post-quantum computer, can collapse an AES key in a few minutes, right? But that exists today as a thought experiment. It doesn't exist in reality. The closest we've come to that is there was a Canadian company called D-Wave Systems, and they were actually recently sold. And the guy who designed the quantum computer at D-Wave, brilliant engineer, brilliant man, still teaches computer science at Simon Fraser. But they could only do classifiers. They could only do image classification. They couldn't do Shor's algorithm. They couldn't do the sieve of Eratosheens. They couldn't do these traditional cryptographic attacks. That being said, in the world of encryption, when you're dealing with it at its core, it's designed to protect from criminal organizations that do not have access to quantum computers, right? There's still that $25, $35 million barrier to entry where the only people that are going to do it are relatively wealthy governments. And even then, it's like, are they actually going to use the resources to go after your keys, right? Right. And my favorite reference to that one is an old XKCD where there's a crypto nerd and he's like, oh, they'll never get my data. It's encrypted with 4,000 bit AES. and then the meathead next to him is like, yeah, take this $5 wrench and beat him with it until he gives you the password. Right. Like there's always simpler ways to go about these things. And people, they like to go to the hard attacks first, or they like to go to the complicated ones. And it's like, if you've got an AGI that can do automated red teaming, you're basically going to bankrupt every organization that's doing that now. And it's about a $500 million a year industry. So you'd be like, yeah, I'm going to release this to do this tomorrow. And obviously I'm going to go through all the legal rigmarole to go out and do it. But then I'm going to buy Fortinet and Cisco because I'm now worth more than they are. And it's sort of like, that's the reality of the environment, right? We have these organizations, we have these people who do this. They get trained in these sorts of things. So when they come back to us and they're like, well, yes, it's a risk. And, here are the risks for abuse with respect to those systems as they've been developed. But yeah, we're still just at the initial stages. And the flip side of that is you still need to be an expert in that field, right? Like there was a recent instance where a lawyer submitted a fake case docket to a judge, and the judge looked at him and he's like, this is all made up, right? And so you still need to have experts behind it to be able to review and check the actual work, even if it's malware, right? You still need to have a good malware programmer who can say, yes, this will work, this will work, this will work, and these things won't.
Yep. Yeah, there's no truer test than that than ask ChatGPT something that you know it very, very, very well. That's sort of obscure knowledge, and you'll get back something that is like, hey, someone who doesn't know anything about this topic would maybe think that was right. All right, well, this has been a great conversation. I have really enjoyed this discussion, and I hope that our audience has as well. You know, I want to thank Charlie, Hazen, Marius. I want to thank you all so much for taking the time, and thank everyone in the audience for their questions and their attention. All right, thanks everyone. Have a good one.
Bye.